大家好，我姓辜朝明，我想要用中文给这个演讲，是因为我是日本生，美国长大的，我的中文非常不好。如果我用中文的话，恐怕那个内容是1/3或是1/4，所以我想我还是要用英文做这个演讲吧。Okay, so much for that. When I was preparing my slides for this year, I realized that quite a few of them are same as the slides I prepared for you last year. And what that means is that, at least to me, all the factors that I shared with you last year is still true this year. But does that mean we're going to have the same year this year compared to last year? And my answer to that is probably no. And that's because the politics are so much more important this year than last year. Last year, for example, this year we started with a Taiwanese election right here in Taiwan, which was watched by everyone in the world. And then we're going to have, we had a French election just now. We're going to have a British election going on. We're going to have American election quite soon. And all of these are likely to have large impacts going forward. So before I get into the charts, I'd like to mention a few things about political developments that I think we should be aware of. I'm sure many of you have seen the debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump last week. And many of you probably thought it was a pretty horrible performance on the part of Joe Biden. And when I was looking at it, I was flabbergasted too. Oh, the guy's basically finished, I thought. But after second thought, and then the CNN also carried this program of him delivering rally just on the following day. And in the following day program, for those of you who saw that, you probably were shocked to find out that Biden is still very powerful, very alive, very much in control. So what's the difference between his debate performance and what he did in the rally? It's almost like two different persons completely. And my interpretation of what happened in the debate is the following. If you notice, Donald Trump never answered the questions that were posed to him. Not only that, he had so many facts that were not true. I mean, so many arguments that were simply not true. CNN, for example, their fact finders found out that there were at least 30 non-truths in Trump's statements. Now, if you are debating someone like that on the stage, and if you are Mr. Joe Biden, you know, Joe Biden, maybe not the greatest president in the US history, but he's a very decent person. And if you're a decent person, arguing with someone who is completely ignoring all the rules of the debate, saying something that was not true at all, right after another, I think you will find it very, very difficult to debate this person. I mean, I think Joe Biden was flabbergasted by his opponent's performance, that he could be talking that kind of nonsense for that long. And I have a similar experience myself, actually. When we were debating policy in Japan, it's almost 20 years ago now, such a long story. This very influential commentator later became one of the ministers of the Japanese government and the Koizumi government, argued that, well, I was arguing as because I thought Japan was in balance sheet recession, private sector cannot borrow money, government has to borrow money to keep the economy going. He came out and said, but the government has too much debt, government cannot borrow. Private sector has too much debt, and therefore private sector cannot borrow, and therefore the Bank of Japan has to do more. And when ordinary people hear that, you say, well, the government cannot do it, and therefore the central bank has to do more. Sounds pretty reasonable. But for those of you who study economics, you know that this is complete nonsense, right? Because for monetary policy of the Bank of Japan to work, someone has to respond to the central bank's policy borrow the money and spend it. But if the private sector cannot spend, households has too much debt, and he wants government not to borrow and spend, then the monetary policy will be totally useless. And over the last 30 years, I think history has proven that monetary policy was largely useless in Japan. After all that quantitative easing, Japanese inflation remained at the very low levels all the way until the pandemic. But when you are debating this guy, and suddenly he comes out with a statement like that, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to take apart his argument and explain that without either public sector or the private sector must be borrowing money to keep the economy going? That takes a long time to explain why that is the case. So I was kind of lost. So, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I'm continue to make my points or to argue against this guy's argument. And that's when you get lost. And I think Biden was in exactly the same position. If he didn't argue back, then people think what Donald Trump said was true. But if you do go back and try to argue, then you are in his pace, and you have to take apart this, a little that. You don't look very strong in your arguments. And so I think Joe Biden was taken aback. So my guess is that he is so upset now that Donald Trump did not follow these debate rules at all. So in the September event, if that happens, I'm sure Biden will come up very, very strongly also, probably ignoring some of the questionnaires' questions. But of course, there are a lot of people in the Democratic side saying, we have to replace Biden, he's too old. And that can still happen. But my guess is that Biden will fight back. And if he really shows what he is capable of doing, which he was able to do the next day in the rally. For those of you who haven't seen it, maybe it's on YouTube somewhere, you can look at it. I mean, he came out very, very powerful, very, very effective, very, very alert. So someone like that, I don't think will give up easily. And so there will be quite a bit of debate going back and forth within the Democratic camp to see whether he should be replaced or he should be allowed to continue. So that's one thing. But of course, American people looking at the debate, many of them who argue that, oh, Trump won. But pretty soon they begin to start thinking, but did Trump say the right things? Are they all true? And once people start thinking about these things, their view of Trump might change also. However, there is one point in the Trump's argument that we have to all take very seriously. And that is that his anti-free trade stance, that he's talking about raising tariffs 10% all around, he even said 60% on the Chinese products and things like that, is very much anti-free trade. And that affects all of us here in Asia, especially countries like Taiwan, Japan, even China, who benefited hugely from free trade. Then what do I mean by saying his arguments merits our concern? It merits our concern because he is right about the problems of free trade, or the way the free trade was practiced. For those of you who remember your free trade lessons in economics, we were all taught that free trade creates both winners and losers in the same economy. But the gain of the winners were much bigger than the loss of the losers, and therefore taken together, the country benefits. That's what I learned. Maybe some of you learned this also. But none of these professors taught us that for this to be true, the trade must be in balance or in surplus. If the trade is in balance or in surplus, the number of losers from free trade will be always smaller than the number of winners, in which case free trade will remain in place. United States ran trade deficit for the last 43 years, continuously. Every year, they kept on running huge trade deficits, 3-4% GDP, all the way for 40-some years. Then what happens? The number of Americans who feel that they are losers of free trade kept on growing. By 2016, the number of this group, people who consider themselves losers of free trade, were able to put Donald Trump into the White House. And on that same year, Hillary Clinton, who was fighting Donald Trump at the time, she started out with basically a free trade position. But once she realized that Donald Trump is gathering huge support, she herself changed. She was against TPP by the end of the campaign. And if you remember, when Hillary Clinton was selected to be the Democratic presidential candidate in the hall full of Democrats, they were all carrying one sign. And that sign said, "No to TPP." So Democrats, Republicans, all of them were against free trade. And Joe Biden, who took over from Donald Trump, kept all the tariffs that Donald Trump put in and still added some of his own. So we really have to be careful about how Americans feel toward free trade, because we benefited, those of us in East Asia and the rest of the world benefited so much from free trade. And where did the things go wrong? I must say it went wrong with the exchange rate. The dollar was allowed to remain far too strong relative to the competitiveness of American industries. And that's how so many Americans lost their jobs in the manufacturing, and US manufacturing became smaller and smaller as a result. So some other parts of the US economy are doing great. I mean, in terms of share values, Mr. Xi Jinping can tell you that just a few American companies is dominating the whole world. But how about the rest of the Americans? They are finding that just their job security are threatened, they're losing their income and so forth. So all of us in East Asia and the rest of the world will really have to look at this problem more carefully and to see whether allowing dollar to remain so strong is such a good thing or not. And if Americans cannot help themselves, those of us in Asia might have to do some of things by ourselves. For example, countries around this region will collectively move the exchange rates higher, which is what happened during the Plaza Accord of 1985. Something like that may be necessary to keep free trade still very much in place, because that is what led to this great economic growth for mankind. And the last thing I want to talk about politics, I don't want to get into too much of it, is that what's happening in Russia, I think, having a huge problem, huge influence for the rest of the world. By the end of last year, I think US and China were actually coming closer together. I mean, there's a huge suspicion on both sides. But the fact that Mr. Xi Jinping actually traveled to San Francisco, talked with Biden, just two of them, for quite a long time, and give that speech to businessmen in San Francisco, which I'm sure some of you have seen it. It's a remarkable speech. It sounds like last 10 years never happened. He basically says, well, Mr. Biden says we are competitors. No, I don't want to be a competitor. I want to be your partner. That's what Xi Jinping says on that speech. So he's trying to move closer together, and then maybe Mr. Biden was willing to reciprocate. So I was kind of hopeful that by now, situation between the two sides would be a little better, tensions would be a little lower. Then the Russians start winning the war in Ukraine, which was totally unexpected. And when the Russians start making some advances, United States, Western Europe basically panicked. Said, oh my gosh, Russia is actually winning. Well, why are the Russians doing so well? Well, because China is behind it. So American government is putting tremendous pressure on the Chinese. European governments start putting huge pressure on the Chinese. That kind of made it difficult for Mr. Xi Jinping to come closer to the West if he wanted to maintain this relationship with Russia. And some of the problems we are facing in this part of the world, Russians do, Chinese doing all sorts of military exercises against Taiwan, against Philippines, I think has a lot to do with the fact that Russians are making advances in Ukraine. Well, put it differently, if Russians were not making advances, were actually kind of in a retreat, I think situation in this part of the world would have been much, much better. So we really have to be careful of, Ukraine is so far away from us, but something that happens to Ukraine, then affects China, then affects us. These things we have to be all very much aware of this year, because those were not the issues we had to be concerned about last year. Well, so much for that political issues. So let me get back into economics. The advanced countries, United States in particular, but others as well, have been fighting inflation since 2021. And I would argue that they were, so if I may start with a conclusion, I think the inflation issues, these countries are winning the war against inflation. 2 out of 4 factors that brought us inflation are largely behind us. There's 2 still left, but the other 2 are already behind us in my view. So what are those 4 factors? 1 on demand, 1 on energy, and 2 on supply. 1 on demand is that after pandemic, all these countries or the businesses reduced their inventories during the pandemic, not knowing when the customers will ever come back after the lockdowns. But once the pandemic was over, everybody wanted to increase inventories all at the same time. 1 or 2 companies trying to increase inventory is not a big deal. But if everyone tries to increase inventories at the same time, there'll be a huge increase in demand or orders relative to productive capacity at the time, and that increased prices in no small way. That's basically the inflation we faced 2021, 2022. But now the inventory is building, and it's more or less back to the previous trend. There's still some sectors that, for example, in auto industries, they still argue that they don't get enough semiconductors from Taiwan, I suppose, and therefore they're not producing as much as they want to. I mean, you hear things like that, but overall, I think this issue is mostly behind us. Then on the energy, as I indicated to you earlier, energy market is going through a very big transformation. Until 2021, energy prices or energy market was basically the same energy market we had for decades. But 2021, so many countries, including China, Europe, start passing laws saying you can no longer sell gasoline cars, you can no longer sell diesel cars after 2030, 2035, and so forth, which means the demand for fossil fuel will be falling after 2035. But the whole premise of whole premise for energy suppliers until that day was that demand is always increasing. And on this assumption, they were able to take risks, exploring for new gas fields, exploring for new oil fields, and so forth. Exploring for oil fields and gas fields, a very risky business. But they had one very strong certainty, and that is that the demand is always there. So they were able to take some risks. But now they realize that in 10 years or so, demand for your product could be falling, and could be falling quite sharply. Then what do? You have to cover all your costs and make handsome profits in this remaining, for example, 11 years. But next year it'll be only 10. The following year is only 9. In that industry, you have to become very careful in choosing what kind of projects you are going to explore. So the supply could fall quite rapidly if we are not careful in this kind of environment. And in order to counter that, the prices will have to remain relatively high. So my guess is that the prices we saw during the Ukraine war was, of course, totally out of whack. But my guess is that energy prices will remain high and might have to continue to remain high to make sure that we do not run into supply shortages and to make sure that renewables can come in. If energy prices remain at these very low levels, there's only so much energy, only so much renewables that can come in. But if energy prices remain relatively high, more renewables will come in, and we will be able to stop this global warming. So for both policy reasons, that is to say, encourage more renewables to come in, and to make sure that there won't be real supply shortages, my guess is that energy prices will remain relatively high, and that will be inflationary for all of us. And on the supply side, I think there were two problems. One is those that are directly driven by pandemic. There are too much orders coming in because everybody was trying to rebuild their inventories, but the supply side cannot meet all these demands, and the prices went up sharply. That problem, I think, is largely behind us. But there's another problem here, and that is about the labor market. So many countries laid off workers very rapidly during the pandemic. And when you lay off that many workers all at the same time, like 20 million people lost their jobs in the United States. And then when the economy begins to recover, you try to call them back. But if it's just one or two companies laying off workers, many of the workers will stay in your area, stay in industries nearby, and then they will be able to come back and work for you again. But when 20 million people lost their jobs all at the same time, none of them have this luxury of staying in similar industries, in the similar geographic location, waiting to be recalled back to the original companies. They all scattered all around the countries. And so when they tried to recall them, they could not get the people with the same level of skills anymore. It was like labor supply curve shifting to the left if you adjust for skill levels. So the number of workers are there, but the quality of those workers dropped very sharply during those year and a half when they could not work in the industries they were trained to work in. And that increase in wages, which of course turned out to be very inflationary, these are the wage growth, and these are the countries that laid off workers a lot. The wages went up very sharply in those countries. This problem, I'm afraid, will be with us for maybe another year or two. Because human beings cannot just become computer engineers. You cannot make steel workers into computer engineers or computer engineers into steel workers. These things take a long time. And so my guess is that this part of the problem will be still with us for another year or two. But overall, I would say we are making good progress toward inflation. And we should be entering a world that existed before 2021 at some point, except in Japan. Now, I know there's a huge interest in this part of the world, outside Asia, even the United States and elsewhere, about Japan today. Japanese share prices are all-time high now. And a lot of people say, wow, Japan is really coming back strong. Well, for those of us who live in Japan, we are kind of surprised that there's so much interest in Japan today, because for those of us, of course, Japan made a lot of changes, lots of progress, but it was a gradual process. But what happened to stock market? Sort of bang. A lot of foreigners, I would argue, were underestimating Japan, and I will talk about that later, for a long time, especially when they were looking at this working age population. It shrunk 13 million over the last 20-some years. Shrinking population like this, you would think the economies would be doing very poorly. And that's the argument a lot of people used. But when you look at the actual number of people working, which is this red line here, it is actually at all-time high. So where's this population problem? The number of people working in Japan is actually increasing, not decreasing. And this is why Japan was doing quite well throughout this period, instead of shrinking, as this graph suggests. What that means is that labor participation rate in the Japanese labor market increased very substantially, largely because of more women in the labor force and more healthy old people continuing to work in the labor market. So for those two reasons, the number of workers working in Japan is at all-time high. So demographic is not the issue why Japanese economy slowed down. It was more the balance sheet problem, not a demographic problem. So that's the good part of the story. The bad part of the story is what? Well, these two lines can never cross, right? The number of working age population can never be less than the people actually working. What that means is that the labor market in Japan is becoming tighter and tighter and tighter. So in a lot of industries, they are no longer able to find workers. So they have to raise prices or just get out of that activity altogether. So what that means is that, at least for Japan, labor market-driven higher wages will be an issue going forward. It's not necessarily bad, because if labor market is really short of workers, wages will go up and people will have much better income. But this will have impact on Japanese economic growth going forward, and inflation could pick up in Japan from this source, not from the sources that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, then are we going back to the world that existed before 2020, before the pandemic? And my answer to that is yes, I think we are going back to that world, because those factors that brought us deflation are still with us. And for that, I believe there are three factors involved, two on demand side and one on supply. The demand part is what I call balance sheet recession. And you heard me about this all the time, so I'm sure you got sick of it by now. Balance sheet recession happens when people leverage themselves up during the bubble. And people, because they leverage themselves up, you end up with a bubble. And then the bubble bursts, all the liabilities are there. As the prices collapse, people start repairing their balance sheets all at the same time. And when people start repairing balance sheets all at the same time, there will be excess savings in the private sector that can become a leakage to the income stream, and the economy start shrinking. And we experienced that in Japan starting 1990. We experienced that in the United States and Europe after 2008. And we are experiencing that right now in China. But this process of everybody paying down debt, well, at some point, you keep on paying down debt, at some point your balance sheet is balanced again. And I'm happy to tell you that Japanese balance sheets are all repaired. Most American balance sheets are in good shape. European balance sheets are not as good as the American ones yet, but they are in the process of being repaired. So the balance sheet problem, the physical balance sheet problem, is largely behind us. Balance sheets are repaired. But another point of the balance sheet recession is that repairing balance sheet is a very painful process. I hope none of you had experience like that, but if you are one of them, and you have to continue pay down debt every year, once you finish paying down debt, you say to yourself, I will never borrow money again. I don't want to see bankers again. Oh, sorry, there's so many bankers here, but that's what typically happens for the people who have to go through this balance sheet repair. Sorry. And as a result, even in Japan, which finished repairing balance sheets more than 10 years ago, people are still borrowing much less than they are able to borrow. In the United States, same thing. In Europe, same thing. They are not borrowing as much as they could borrow relative to the level of interest rates. And and this is a kind of a trauma, right? Psychological trauma. Balance sheet is already clean, but they just don't want to go through the same process again, so they refuse to borrow. Americans who lived through the Great Depression, which was a balance sheet recession back in 1929, they never borrow money until they died because the experience was so bad. We have that now in Japan, we have now in Europe, and we're going to have that in China too. What that means is that household sector is saving, but the corporate sector is not borrowing. So there's always this excess savings within the economy. And that's what causes the deflation. So people are not borrowing money. And when people are not borrowing money, government has to borrow money. Because in the national economy, someone is saving money, someone has to borrow money to keep the economy going, right? In the usual circumstances, central bank will bring interest rates down and to make sure that the number of borrowers and number of lenders will be equalized. But once people are traumatized or we have balance sheet problems, you bring interest rates down to zero. People still refuse to borrow. And in that situation, you cannot tell the private sector you have to borrow, especially if the private sector still has a balance sheet problems. Then the government has to borrow. But we were all taught, in our universities days that government borrowing is a bad thing. In Taiwan, there's a rule that says government borrowing cannot go beyond certain amounts, right? Under ordinary circumstances, when private sector is maximizing profits or have no trauma toward debt, then of course government should not borrow. But once in a while, when the private sector falls into bubbles and balance sheet recessions, government must borrow. But we were not taught that, and therefore lots of governments refused to borrow, especially the European governments after 2008. And that's why European economies struggled for so long. Then the government told the central bank, hey, we cannot borrow, so you do the hard work. But as I indicated to you earlier at the beginning, monetary policy works only if there are borrowers out there. If there are no borrowers, central bank monetary policy doesn't work at all. Central bank raising interest rates or lowering interest rates, it's just a transfer of income from debtors to the creditors, or from creditors to the debtors. The amount of gain on one side is exactly equal to the amount of loss on the other side. So it should be neutral. Only if people respond to this lowering or raising interest rates by borrowing and spending more, or borrowing less and spending less, it's this part that works on the economy. But for that, you need to have borrowers. And if there are no borrowers, central bank policy doesn't work. So as a result, we ended up with a deflationary situation in Europe, United States, and Japan since 1990. I'm afraid this problem is still very much with us because of the trauma. They just don't want to borrow, even though their balance sheets are repaired. And this may take quite a while to really overcome. The other factors that brought us deflation was, of course, globalization. It makes more sense to invest in Vietnam or Indonesia or Bangladesh than in Japan or United States or even Taiwan in some cases. So in those cases, companies are maximizing profits, balance sheet is not a problem, but they're not borrowing in the country. They're borrowing over there because what they need to invest in Vietnam is a Vietnamese currency, not Taiwan dollar. And so many companies are doing that. These companies are all maximizing profits. But domestically, household sector is still saving, corporate sector no longer borrowing because all the borrowing is happening somewhere else. And then you end up with the same problem as a balance sheet recession, and you end up in deflation. I'm afraid that is still with us, because there's so many other countries that are trying to take factories from advanced countries or even from China in Southeast Asia. And once products are made over there, they're imported back to the original countries, and then that adds to deflation as well. So these factors are still here. And when you look at that in terms of numbers, this is how the numbers look like. These numbers in the middle, on the orange areas, shows how much savings private sector is generating as a percentage of GDP. And this pink area is from the Lehman crisis to the present period. Lehman crisis to 2 years ago, when interest rates are still zero in most countries. And you see for United States, number like 6.38, Japan 8.24, and then for Eurozone 5.03. These are ridiculously large numbers, right? Because this period, most of the countries had zero interest rates. They should be borrowing 6% of GDP, not saving 6% of GDP. But that's how serious the balance sheet problems they faced were during that period. especially if you compare with the numbers to the right, to the left of them. That's the good times, the bubble period. US was saving only 2.65%, Japan 7.42%, Eurozone only 1.21%. So even though interest rates are much higher here, savings were hugely more once the bubble burst. And where are the numbers now? So if you look at the numbers to the right, US is 5.09, Japan 6.28, Eurozone 4.75. Still, it's not as bad as before, but still a big number. So I would argue that the factors that brought us deflation is still with us. Oh, by the way, the numbers for Taiwan, but Taiwan, because it's a large export country, and Taiwan has been running large current account surplus, you end up having these big numbers. And that's a little bit true with Japan as well. So as a result, all these actions by the central banks in Japan, United States, and Europe failed to produce results. These three lines, sorry to use the same chart every year, but I think this is still very valid in understanding what's going on. The top line is monetary base. That's how much liquidity the central bank put in. The second line is the money supply, how much money we get to spend in our bank accounts. And the third line is how much money the banks lent out. And if you remember your economics, we were all taught that these three lines are supposed to move together. Central bank increases monetary base by 10%, money supply, credit increasing by 10%, and that did exist until 2008, Lehman crisis. Then the central bank at that time run by, this is a US case, Federal Reserve, Chairman Bernanke said, wow, Lehman crisis is so bad, they increased monetary base, QE1, QE2, QE3, almost 400%, but other two completely decoupled, money supply grew gradually. Lending actually fell for the first 3 years because people are paying down debt. It only grew very, very slowly thereafter because they were traumatized by by what happened. And of the three, I pay most attention to the green line because central bank can add all the reserves they want, but for that money to come out of the banking sector and enter the real economy, banks have to lend this money. So there has to be borrowers out there. And this is how much money was lent out. This is about 3% growth per year. And you're not going to get inflation with only money increasing in the economy 3% per year, which is why we had this very low inflation until the pandemic. Now, if you look at the most recent period, there was a little bit of pickup here, which I'm going to talk about a little later, but it is also again slowing down. So in that sense, I don't think we are in a situation where people are borrowing money like crazy. And this is Eurozone, exactly the same situation. There's no pickup here either. This is UK. If you look at the UK, for example, bank lending increased only 6% in the last 15 years. That's a pretty sad picture. Only 6% increase in bank lending in almost 15 years. No wonder the British labor market, conservatives are having so much difficulty in the election. Because this is the only amount of money that actually increased circulating in the British economy. Then Japan, same story. Japan, the bubble burst year 1990, so this is 100 is 1990. In 35 years, Japanese bank lending only increased by 49%. That's less than 1% per year. You're not going to get inflation with that. So this is how we got into the deflationary picture, the deflationary world. And as you can see, it's still with us. So my guess is that after all these external shocks from pandemic is behind us, we will head back to where we were before. And this is Taiwan, by the way. And you notice that Taiwan is very different. In fact, Taiwan is still in the textbook world. Central bank increases monetary base, money supply, credit increasing, and central bank increased the pace. The other two also increased. So Taiwan, under good policy making, central bank and the government, Taiwan avoided all these crazy things that happened with Japan 1990 and the US and Europe after 2008. And I hope this will continue because this is good. This is how the economy is supposed to operate. But if for any reason housing bubble burst in Taiwan or something, then we might enter the kind of balance sheet problems that Chinese are having these days. Then, there's one more point that we have to cover, and that is that this is the magnification of what happened after 2020. So you saw these numbers already, but this is a magnified picture of it. And this is Taiwan. Taiwan is growing very nicely, as you saw. And this is the US, this purple line. There was quite a bit of pickup here for the United States. It's growing at almost like 11%, 12% per year. And that's what shocked the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve suddenly shifted from deflation fighter to inflation fighter. Because if bank lending, if bank lending is growing at 12% per year, we could actually enter a real classic inflation because money supply is growing 12% per year in the economy. Inflation could hit 12% as well. So I think that's why Federal Reserve suddenly shifted. And then we found out something that we never anticipated, that it is actually very difficult to tighten monetary policy when you already have huge excess reserves in the banking system. And this huge excess reserves in the banking system, the amount, because of all the quantitative easing, because of what you saw, the red line, the amount of excess reserves in the United States is like $3.2 trillion. That's a huge number. It's almost 1,700 times bigger than just before the Lehman crisis. So when you have this much excess reserves in the banking system, banks are so willing to lend, right? Because the borrowers disappeared. So when the borrowers start coming back, the banks are so willing to lend. And so even if the central bank is raising interest rates, banks are so willing to lend, and therefore people still could borrow quite easily. So even at, for example, 3% interest rates, it's not the same 3% as before. 3% before means bankers are still very stingy, not giving you, not willing to lend so much. But today's 3%, bankers are very, very willing to lend. So the fees may be lower, other difficult conditions are removed, and so forth. As a result, Federal Reserve raised interest rates to 5%. US financial condition is still quite loose. And this chart shows the Federal Reserve policy rate, and the other one is how tight the US money financial condition is. That is to say, how difficult it is to borrow money. And you can see that Federal Reserve increased interest rates almost 5.5% here, but this blue line that shows how difficult it is to borrow money hardly responded. And it's actually coming down, not up, because bankers are still so willing to money with such a large excess reserves they are carrying. And so Federal Reserve had kept this 5.5% interest rate for almost a year now. Still, stock market is at all-time high, house prices at all-time high, consumption still strong, labor market, unemployment is only around 4.0%. Consumption is still also very strong. We get that result because there's just so much money chasing investment opportunities inside the country. And so 5% today has a different meaning from 5% in earlier period, before 2008. 5% today is maybe only worth 3% compared to world before 2008. So Federal Reserve is realizing the problem and reducing this excess reserves by selling the bonds that it bought. And Chairman Powell is doing it quite rapidly compared to Janet Yellen some years ago. Janet Yellen realized this problem too, so she tried to reduce this excess reserves at this pace, but Chairman Powell is reducing a much faster pace, but still has a long way to go. What that means is that we're going to have a very rocky market, especially at the long end of the bond market in the United States, until this problem is largely behind us. But as long as this huge excess reserves are in the banking system, all these bankers, financial institutions are looking for any opportunity to make money. So if some weak numbers come out, everybody starts buying bonds at the same time, and the bond yields come down. But when the bond yields come down, financial condition is not tight enough to bring inflation rates down. The Federal Reserve guys come out and says, no, that's not right. We are not thinking of lowering interest rates. And the bond market goes up again. And then some weak number comes out, it comes down again. And we have been in this zigzag for full last year. You know, how many times bond yields went up and down? And I'm afraid this kind of condition will continue until this problem is over. So yes, we are heading toward a less inflationary world, but it's going to be a very bumpy road. And in that sense, it's going to be full of shocks, I'm afraid. Let me skip these. Then let me go back to this issue of China and Japan. As I indicated to you earlier, there's quite a bit of interest in Japan these days among investors here in Taiwan, lots of investors in China. They're all looking at Japan for two reasons. One is that Japan seems to be recovering, so it's interesting opportunities. And for the Chinese, Japan is kind of an experience to be learned so that Chinese won't make the same mistake Japanese made 30 years ago. So whenever I see Chinese visitors or when I was invited to speak in China, I start with this chart, which shows what happened to Japan 30 years ago. So this pink chart, pink line shows what happened to Japan's commercial real estate. And Japan's bubble was led by commercial real estate, not by housing. And it went from 20 to 100 in 5 years. So prices went up 5 times in 5 years. So you can imagine what a crazy bubble that was. And when prices all went up, people felt rich, spent a lot of money, so GDP also went up very sharply. Then the bubble burst, came crashing down 87% nationwide. And I tried to imagine that. For example, in Taiwan, that means Taipei prices down 87, Zhanghua down 87, Taoyuan down 87, Keelung down 87, Kaohsiung down 87, Tainan down 87. What kind of economy you think got left in Taiwan with asset prices down 87% nationwide? Then you look at Japanese GDP. It never fell below the peak of the bubble. This line is the peak of the bubble. It was always above the peak of the bubble after experiencing asset prices down 87% nationwide. The amount of wealth Japanese lost was equivalent to 15,000 trillion yen. That's 3 years' worth of 1989 GDP. The amount of wealth Americans lost during the Great Depression, which was another balance sheet recession, was equivalent to 1 year's worth of 1929 GDP. Japan lost 3 years' worth. This is what happened to US GDP. US lost 46% of GDP. Japan did not lose anything. They could do this because government borrowed the money and spent it. If the private sector cannot borrow all the money, all the savings generated, the economy will start shrinking from that point onward. Because if in the national economy, someone is saving money, someone has to be borrowing money to keep the economy going, right? But the Japanese government came in and borrowed the missing part, and that's how the GDP was maintained. So this chart shows who borrowed money and who saved money in Japan. There's a horizontal line going across zero. Above zero, the people saving money, below are the people who are borrowing money. And there's a household line, corporate line, government line, and the rest of the and the rest of the world line, the purple line. And if you add the 4 lines together, you're supposed to get 0. So it shows who borrowed the money and who saved the money. And you can see that it was the corporate sector in Japan that went crazy, borrowed lots of money during the bubble days. And once the bubble burst, it kept on reducing their borrowings. By year 2000, it was above 0. Above 0 means the entire corporate sector is a huge saver. But in the national economy, if household sector is saving money, you want corporate sector to be borrowing money. In the Japanese case, both household sector and corporate sector were borrowing money, saving money to repair their balance sheets, paying down debt. And that went on all the way to the present. So, but the government did the opposite, the green line. Government was running large surplus, running to deficit to stop the economy from weakening. And it was in deficit ever since. That is to offset all the private sector savings. This is already 34 years since the bursting of the bubble. And I already indicated to you that the balance sheet is repaired. Well, how do I know the Japanese balance sheets are repaired? Oh, this chart shows what Japanese companies are doing with their financial liabilities and what they're doing with the financial assets. So if the blue bars goes further up, that means they're increasing their savings. So they're increasing their financial assets. If the orange bars goes further down, that means they're increasing their financial liabilities or borrowings. And during the bubble days, of course, they were borrowing money. And then once you enter the balance sheet recession, orange bars goes above 0. Orange bars above 0 means the entire corporate sector is paying down debt, reducing their financial liabilities. That stops about 10 years ago, 2012 or so. So orange bars are below 0. Orange bars below 0 here means Japanese balance sheets are repaired. Japanese corporate balance sheets are repaired, which is a good sign. But why is this line still above 0, the net line? Sorry, this line with the circles is the net number. And for macroeconomics, we need to look at what's happening on a net basis, and it's still above 0. For the 2 reasons I mentioned to you earlier. It's so much more profitable to invest in Vietnam instead of in Tokyo. So people moving factories from Japan to Vietnam or Indonesia. And the other is this trauma, the psychological resistance to borrow money. And I'm afraid both of them are still there. And as a result, this net number is still above 0. So all these investors looking at Japan today from United States, Europe, they say, is Japan fully back on its feet? Is it really recovering? And I say, well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that big progress was made. Instead of paying down debt, now they're borrowing money, which is good. But the fact that this is still above 0 means we are not fully recovered yet. For the Japanese economy to be considered fully recovered, this line should be below 0. So household sector saving money, corporate sector borrowing money, government can reduce its budget deficit. But right now, because this line is still above 0, government cannot reduce its budget deficit. The government still has to support the economy by borrowing and spending money. So yes, Japan made lots of progress. Japanese economy is far more efficient than it used to be. All of that are true. But macroeconomically, I'm afraid that we are not at the final goal yet. We are almost there, but not there yet. So that's Japan. How about China? Well, this is the official Beijing house prices compared to what happened to Tokyo and Osaka house prices 30 years ago. And even though the pattern is different, the magnitude of the bubble looks like about the same. And even though these numbers indicate that house prices are not falling all that much, we know that it's not true. House prices in Beijing and other Chinese house prices have fallen far more than this. It's just not on the statistics. And to the extent that the house prices have fallen so much, I would argue that China is in balance sheet recession. And you hear a lot of people, Chinese bankers saying people are not borrowing money, or Even if they borrow money, they just put the money back into the bank account instead of spending it, or many of them actually paying down debt. And so in that sense, China is in balance sheet recession. However, there's one point that China is in better situation than in Japan back in 30 years ago, and that is that so many Chinese people are already talking about balance sheet recession. So they know what the disease is. Those of us in Japan 30-some years ago, we had no idea what was going on. No one taught me about balance sheet recession, but you bring interest rates down to zero, nothing happens, you do fiscal stimulus, it works only when you spend it, but then the economy tanks again. No so-called Keynesian pump priming. The pump priming never worked because it took almost 20 years to repair balance sheets. So during that 20 years, private sector could not respond to what the government was doing. But Chinese are already aware of all that. My books are selling very well in China. I never got any money from it, but for some reason. But the fact that my books are selling means people are aware that this disease called balance sheet recession, which is good. But the problem is China has another problem on top of balance sheet recession, and that is that the construction sector is such a large part of Chinese GDP. Japan had a big construction sector back then, but it was already on a declining share of the economy. So during the bubble, I remember prices just went sky high, came crashing down. Construction was not affected all that much. But in the Chinese case, the construction part is huge, 26% of GDP. And so when construction stops or shrinks, that affects the GDP right away. If construction sector shrinks by 10%, Chinese GDP shrinks by 2.6%, and it probably did shrink more than 10% over the last year. So not just the balance sheet problems, but there's a construction recession on top of it. And when you look at what's happening to who is borrowing money and who is saving money in China, you realize that the Chinese companies somehow stopped borrowing money after 2016. I can never get a good answer why this has happened. From 2016, Chinese companies stopped borrowing money. But the fact that they stopped borrowing money means government had to support the Chinese economy. And you can see that the green line, the Chinese general government, had been increasing budget deficit quite substantially, mostly at the local and provincial level, not at the central government level, but local and provincial government level. But they got to a point where it's almost 7% of GDP. Now, one of the reasons why the Chinese government has not come up with a large enough fiscal stimulus to fight balance sheet recession is because of this. If even before the bubble burst, even before balance sheet recession, if the government is running a budget deficit 7% of GDP, and if you have to do, let's say, 5% GDP worth of fiscal stimulus to fight balance sheet recession, then the total deficit will be 12% of GDP. And even those people who understand that you need fiscal stimulus to fight balance sheet recession will be shocked when you hear that you need 12% budget deficit. I will be shocked too if I see this number. So that's one of the reasons why Chinese government has been very slow in coming up with a large fiscal stimulus. But if they don't put in the fiscal stimulus to cover this thing, because, I mean, we don't have number for 2023 yet. China, just like Taiwan, is very slow in coming up with the statistics. And so we don't know exactly what happened last year, but my guess is that they probably borrowed even less. The private sector. So that's a big problem why Chinese government has been very slow in coming up with a fiscal stimulus. The budget deficit is already so large. Remember, government was running budget surplus, so it's easy to go into deficit. But the Chinese government running huge deficit already before balance sheet recession began, then they have to increase this even more to fight it. And China, of course, have this middle income trap. I'm sure you have heard of this term before. If you are the lowest cost producer in the world, all the factories from around the world will come to you. And China was the lowest cost producer in the world for at least 2 decades. Remember when Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy, per capita GDP was only $300 per person per year. Chinese people, just like us, study hard, work hard, and these can be had for only $300. Of course, the factories from around the world, starting from Taiwan, all went to China as a result. But now, per capita GDP in China is $12,000. And there are a lot of other countries that are offering lower wages, just as good infrastructure and so forth. So factories are moving from China to Indonesia, Bangladesh, sometimes even India, Vietnam. Even Chinese factories are moving now. So you get stuck in this middle income trap if all these additional investment stops. And this is a very difficult trap because only 4 countries really, or 3 or 4 countries actually passed the middle income trap. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, that's about it. All the other countries are stuck in the middle income trap. So Chinese government should really think about how to go through this middle income trap. But apparently, we don't see many policies directed to address this issue. And finally, the population. As you know, Chinese population started shrinking last year, just as the bubble burst. And this is a very big issue, for China, because for the Chinese real estate market to recover, people must believe in the narrative that from this point onward, real estate prices will go up, and therefore it's okay to borrow money to buy real estate. But if population is shrinking from that point onward, it's very difficult to come up with a narrative or justify that narrative that land prices are actually bottom and it's not going up from that point onward. And so I usually don't pay much attention to demographics as an explanation for economic developments. But for China, I'm afraid this is something that is have a very large impact. And of course, geopolitical confrontation with the West. Because China sided with the Russians, it is alienating Western countries, but the West account for something like 58% of global GDP. Per capita GDP is over 60,000. So that's where all the rich customers are for Chinese products. The non-West, which is Russia, India, South America, and so forth, that's about 25% of global GDP, but per capita GDP is only 13,000, which is no higher than the Chinese own GDP. So if Chinese lose this market and only left with that market, I won't be surprised if the Chinese businessmen refuse to increase their investments at home. Because even if you enlarge your factories and increase your productive capacity, there might not be market for those products if the Western markets began to shut down on the Chinese products. So putting this all together, I think Chinese are facing far more difficult problems than the Japanese faced 30 years ago. Both Japan and China faced this issue about balance sheet recession. And on balance sheet recession alone, China is ahead of Japan in a sense that they already know what the disease is. We in Japan had no idea what the disease is. So we were very depressed and very worried. But unfortunately, the policy part of the Chinese government has been very slow because of the huge deficit that they already carry before the balance sheet recession began. And then there's a construction recession that Japan didn't really have to worry about. And furthermore, Chinese businesses stopped borrowing money starting around 2016. And Of course, there may be many reasons for why that happened. Middle income trap, all these regulatory changes suddenly in China. Recently, China just announced that those of us in the financial market can only be paid a certain amount, that anything goes beyond that amount will be taxed or be looked at and all of that. You know, these regulations come out of nowhere and usually announced in the evening of a night before. So when that happens, you know, everybody's taken aback. A lot of people end up losing lots of money. And, and of course, population decline. And one other issue that when I'm talking to Chinese people, either in Japan or in China, I often ask this question. During the pandemic, a lot of advanced countries, Taiwan, Japan, United States, give a lot of financial support to the households, to the companies. China didn't do any of that. So all these companies and households had to weather lockdowns and all sorts of things with their own savings. And of course, Chinese people save a lot, as you saw in the earlier chart. So they had a lot of savings, but they were largely depleted. And those who couldn't pay anymore, of course, all went bankrupt. But for even those that survived, the savings has been depleted. So once the economy begins to normalize, the first thing many of these people wanted to do is to rebuild their savings, right? To where they think is safe again. But when everybody starts rebuilding their savings all at the same time, you get into a balance sheet recession from the asset side, not from the liability side, or not just from the liability side, from the asset side. Because if everybody's increasing savings, that reduces the demand, and you end up in a balance sheet recession as well. So, and there's no statistics on this issue, so I have to ask these people that come to see me or when I'm speaking to them in China. And when I mention this issue, all these people there say, So they're doing it. And if they're doing it, that means we have a balance sheet recession from the asset side, not just from the liability side. And finally, this geopolitical confrontation with the West. As I indicated to you earlier, if this Russian advance in Ukraine did not happen, starting February of this year, maybe the geopolitical tension would have been much less. But because it did happen, American position on China became much stiffer, European became much harsher, and I'm afraid this geopolitical tension ended up increasing instead of decreasing. And of course, that's not good for the Chinese economy. So putting this all together, I would argue that China is facing difficulties that are far more difficult to handle than what Japan faced 34 years ago. And the recent moves by the Chinese trying to support their real estate market and so forth, they are all in the right direction, but the amounts involved, I think, is far too small to turn the situation around. And so my guess is that China will remain, Chinese economy will remain pretty weak going forward. I'm sure government will do a lot of things to make sure that it doesn't completely collapse, but it's not going to be the engine for economic growth for the world or for this part of the world anytime soon, given all the problems they have. And one Chinese commentator told me that, you know, when China has a problem, we have 3 stages of response. When domestic problem is very bad, but Chinese government does not want people to pay too much attention to these problems, they go after movie stars, the singers, and the artists and so forth. And they go after, you know, those movie stars. But when the economic problem or domestic problem gets even bigger, they go after the Japanese. So Japan gets somehow bashed left and right. When the problem is really big, they go after Taiwan. The fact that they're coming suggests to me that their problems are very big. Thank you very much.